Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm ffinlo Costain. This programme is part of a series in which I talk to farmers who are delivering agroecological agriculture on their farms. The farmers in this series are working with the Soil Association as Agroecology Ambassadors and as part of their 10 Years for Agroecology project. The series has also been inspired by the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission's work on farming for change. As Agroecology Ambassadors, the farmers in these programmes are inviting people, virtually of course, onto their farms to help develop a better understanding of what agroecological farming entails. Today, we're looking at mixed farming, and I'm joined by two superb farmers, both tenant farmers, who are putting agroecological principles into action. Ben Andrews farms at Broadward Hall in Herefordshire. He farms beef, cereals and veg with his father in around 600 acres of organic land. He can be found on Twitter and on Instagram under the handle at Ben Theo Andrews. Robert Wilson farms at Cowbog Farm in the Scottish Borders. They have around 250 head of beef cattle, but the stars of the show, they say, are their Romany Hereford herd. You can find Robert on Twitter under the handle at Farm and Kitchen, or on Instagram as at Wilson's Farm and Kitchen. Welcome both. To start us off, I wonder if you could just briefly describe your farm and tell us what you produce and what agroecology really means for you. And Ben, I wonder if I can come to you first.
So our farm split over two sites. So there's 450 acres, which is down on what's called the Hereford lowlands. We've got the River Arrow running through the middle of it. That floods the river meadows annually, which is where we graze the cattle. Then we have some really top-notch grade 1 and 2 agricultural land that we grow our cereals and vegetables on. Being a mixed farm, of course, everything's interconnected. The cattle, when they're in the sheds, they're housed on nice fresh straw, and then in the spring, summer, sheds are mucked out and the manure goes to fertilizer ground.
So just to clarify, I mean, I said 600 acres and you said 450. There's a bit of a discrepancy, and that's 100.
Of course.
You've got the new farm as well, but it's okay.
Yeah.
We'll come to that, and that's your extra 150 acres. I wonder if you could just sort of sum up, what agroecology means for you, and why you think of yourself as an agroecological farmer.
Well, we've been organic now for 20 years this year. The initial change to organic farming, you think, well, organic is just conventional farming, but without the inputs. So without the synthetic fertilizers and the synthetic pesticides. But you need to think about it in an ecosystem point of view. So you need to be encouraging natural predators to control the pests because you don't have synthetic pesticides to use. You need to look at ways to build soil fertility without the help of synthetic fertilizers because you've got no other way of doing it. And if you don't build fertility, then you have poor soil health and you can't grow crops. So you have to really think about working with nature instead of against it to really make the most of farming without any chemical inputs.
And Robert, what is it that you farm?
We farm, the 250 head of Herefords that you mentioned, and also some arable ground, which is predominantly malting barley for the brewing and distilling industry.
And what about agroecology for you? What do you think it is that you do differently from a standard conventional farmer?
Well, although we're conventional, which is probably slightly different to some of the other Soil Association ambassadors, we try and farm, with nature in mind and with the biodiversity in mind. We're on a lowland farm similar to Ben that floods quite a lot in the bottom, and we've got a lot of water margins and water courses. So we've made a conscious decision to fence off as many of those as possible so stock can't get in. Where there's an arable field, we've got a 6 metre grass margin alongside these water courses.
Now, you talked about having, your 250 Herefords, and you have Pedigree Herefords as well, and I think that's a smaller number, isn't it? And how big is the Pedigree herd?
Of the 250, we've got 70 Pedigree Hereford cows and their followers. So we've probably got about 170 Pedigree Herefords in total, and the rest are commercial cattle. It takes up most of the time, the pedigrees are feeding the stock. So certainly over the winter, you're looking after them in the sheds, very similar to what Ben's doing. Some of the commercial cattle are still outside on root crops.
Fantastic. Now, you're both tenant farmers, and so I think it's worth sort of having just a chat through that element a little bit. Ben, your family have been tenants on the land since the 1930s. I think you're third generation. I just wonder wonder how being the tenant rather than the owner affects the decisions that you're able to make about the farm.
There are definitely certain things that we can't do and we have to apply for permission to do, such as use of buildings or, where we could maybe add some value somewhere else. It's not quite as straightforward as just cracking on with renting out a shed space, extra shed space to someone else. There are other things like planting trees. I'm keen to look at planting more trees on the farm, but again, this is something that needs to be discussed with the landlord. But the other thing, of course, being tenants, is that you have to make every acre count. We don't own this farm. We've got no equity in it. So when we leave, we just walk away from it, and it's despite being here for 90 years. So you really do have to think about what can I do to make this work? You have that rent check to pay every month, and you need to be making money from it, which a lot of people will say that being organic farmers or agroecological farmers is not as commercially viable as conventional farming. But we've been doing it for 20 years, so we're still here.
And Robert, you're also a tenant. You've got 2 farms under your control as well, and you've got different tenancy agreements. One's on a secure tenancy.
The secure tenancy, which is on Cowbog Farm, it was started in 1938 by my grandfather. He came into the farm. It's much more secure. Ben talked about the equity. Well, we can get compensation for improvements that we've done to the land and we've done to the farm over those last 80 years. Recently, the Scottish Government and the Tenant Farming Commission have been sort of shoring up those regulations about leaving and what you can be refunded for. It gives you a little bit more security.
And my understanding is that security is generational as well, that if you have successors that want to take the farm on from within the family, then it's secure for them too.
Yeah, we could pass our lease on to any blood relative who can fit the criteria to look after the land and look after the farm properly. And that's gone further now. Any tenant farmer who wants to retire can assign the lease to a new entrant or a progressive farmer on the understanding that the landlord doesn't want to take the lease back in hand himself. So if he does that, he has to compensate the tenant. So there is a little bit more equity involved in leases now.
So Ben, clearly Scottish law is different to English law.
I'd say we are fairly secure. We're on a 3-generation, it's called Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, which is a fantastic tenancy to be on. And my dad renegotiated, so he's the first tenant, I'll be the second. And then so if I have kids and they want to farm, then they'll have the right to be the third. Improvements to the buildings are a little harder. So we're on a full repairing and insuring tenancy. So we're responsible for the buildings. If we put a building up, then we can get it down as tenants' improvements, but that's only if they agree to it. And after 25 years, it then automatically becomes their property. Okay. Whereas if we wanted to put a shed up and they didn't agree, it would be tenants' fixtures, and when we came to the end of the tenancy, we'd have to take it with us.
So that's tenancy, and that's your farms on tenancy. Yeah. Well, Ben, you've just bought 150 acres up on Hilliar Ground, which must be fantastic for a whole range of reasons. First of all, it won't flood in quite the same way, but also it's your own. You can do whatever you want to do with it.
I'm so excited about it because it is a really beautiful 150 acres of ring-fenced land. Yeah, the main farm that we're tenants on is on the edge of a town. It's got a road running through the middle of it, another main road and a railway track on the edge of it. So it's not quite the bucolic idyll that a lot of people might think farming is. So up in the hills, it is absolutely stunning. We've got some incredible features like gullies with these massive oak and ash trees shooting up out of them, and gets a bit more snow up there. It's so quiet, and it's perfect for conversion to organic ground, which is what we've done from 1st of January. It's in organic conversion, and also enrolled into the mid-tier countryside stewardship scheme as well. So there's some things we're going to be doing up there to encourage wild birds and just generally to boosting biodiversity.
Is ruminants on there?
It's going to be keeping on with the mixed theme. So there will be some fantastic grazing. There's some lovely patches of woodland for woodland grazing, spring-fed ponds for water. There's a borehole up there as well. But yeah, there will be also some arable land into the rotation where we will grow whole crop silage and some spring beans just all keeping it growing all our own feed for our cattle. We're not no-till. It's quite hard getting onto the no-till bandwagon as organic. We do plough, but we also integrate long clover lays. So we've got 5 years of fertility building clover to help boost nitrogen, but also organic matter as well.
When we've spoken in the past, you've talked about the area being great for agroforestry, and I wonder if you have a sense of, what does that mean for you? What do you hope to do? What, in a perfect world, what would you like to do? And would that planting be integrated with the stock or separate from the stock?
Love to integrate more silver pasture into the system. So that's woodland grazing, being able to plant some trees that can be harvested for firewood or for general energy crops through pollarding. But also different trees are beneficial to cattle in different ways, as natural wormers, and they will then browsing animals. Cattle aren't designed to just graze one variety of grass. In the wild, ruminants would have taken a little bit from this plant, a little bit from that plant, and so just trying to reintroduce a bit more of a natural habitat for them.
Robert, just going back to your Pedigree Romany Herefords, they're at the centre of your business, and you also produce beef, malting barley for the whisky industry. What made you choose the products that you produce?
I think the farm did, basically. It suited, I don't want to sound like a traditional farmer saying, just what my grandfather did. It does suit the land we've got and suit the farm. The cattle are very easy doing. They suit our permanent grassland that we graze them on. We've got very few grass lays. The only ones we've got are in the arable rotation, just to retain a bit of organic matter and give the soil a rest. So they suit the land that we're grazing them on. And the malting barley, we've got fairly light land, and it doesn't suit big wheat crops, so it suits to growing low nitrogen.
So with the barley, you're moving that, you're rotating that around the farm as well?
Yes, we tend to grow it for a few years in the same field and then break it up with grass or root crops for the cows. And we've also got a neighbour that grows some broccoli on our land if we feel we need something just a little different.
As an agroecological farmer, are you sort of taking steps to reduce the amount of fertilizers and so on that you're using?
Yeah, we're lucky being a mixed farm that we've got a lot of access to farmyard manure, which can go back into the system and go back into the soil and provide nutrients that way. With the grass lays, certainly we've got a fairly high percentage of red clover in those lays, and that again fixes a lot of nitrogen in the soil. A lot of the less productive land we have put over to environmental crops, especially down by our riverside. It's very, very light land there. It suits us better to put those into crops that last all year, providing a nectar source and a food source for birds over the winter, a nesting habitat for ground nesting birds in the spring. And even if we don't make any money on that, we were losing money when we were trying to grow crops on it. So it fits our system.
So do you find yourself using chemical sprays in addition to those measures that you've talked about?
We do. We use as little as possible, but we do need them. A lot of the crops being a bit further north, the weather can be a bit inclement, and we need to watch the likes of fungicides. We don't use pesticides on the arable crops, but we do use herbicides and fungicides.
And what level of control would you say that you have over your routes to market? I mean, I imagine with the pedigree herd, you're much more in the position of being price makers rather than price takers. But are you sort of fixed into contracts and have limited control over the other things, or do you feel that you have some measure of control?
We've got some measure of control in that you can look at the future markets and see what price you can get at harvest time next year. So last week, on a bit of land that we contract farm for our landlord, we sold the wheat for next November at a price that I thought was economic for us to do so. And again, with the crops we've got in the ground, or we will put in the ground in March and April, we can take a price now for selling them at harvest. So it is the market price, but we can choose when to take it, or we can have a gamble and just see what it's like at harvest. With the beef side of the business, like you say, the pedigree stock, we can be price makers acres on that, and we can obviously make a better price by producing, or demand a better price by producing better cattle. The beef side of it, the cattle aren't good enough for selling as pedigree cattle. Some of those we probably are price takers, but we're trying to increase the price we can get by selling a bit more beef directly to consumers.
Ben, you produce vegetables, cereals and beef. You contracted to M&S, I think, for your beef. What happens to the cereals and the veggies?
The cereals, most of them actually end up going for stock feed, but if we can get the right spec on the oats, then we have managed to get them to organic porridge oats, which is fantastic. The vegetables all go to Able&Co. It's a big box scheme that operates across the whole of England now, most of the UK as well, I think. They are a fantastic company to deal with. We are at that sort of stage where we are probably growing too much to just serve locally, but not quite big enough to go into supermarkets. So there aren't many spaces within that. So finding someone like Able&Co that are fair to deal with, who you can have a constructive conversation about prices and that don't screw you over when you're unable to fulfill an order. It's really refreshing, especially considering, you know, I speak to friends who have supermarket contracts, and when it goes right, it goes really right. But then, you know, if they don't want something, they will find any excuse to reject it. So it's nice to be working with people who are so fair, really. With the beef, like you said, the M&S contract is great, but I'd like to supply more locally. But over the past few years, there's been this quite an issue with the number of abattoirs really decreasing, and there's been just the growth of 3 or 4 major players, the likes of ABP or Foyle, or it just means that there are much fewer organic certified slaughterhouses to send your cattle to. So where we are, the closest is Ellesmere, which is a good, over an hour's drive away. And with a push by the government to reduce the amount of time that animals can spend in transit to an abattoir, it's really something needs to happen to maybe bring a few smaller ones back, because the small ones around us are just too small. One thing I would just point out is that from the COVID outbreak, if there had an outbreak in these meat processing factories, it would shut them down. And that meant that if they're shut down, that's doing a lot more damage than, say, 1 or 2 localized food processing centres getting shut down would be. So we actually had some cattle having to travel to Glasgow because that was the nearest place to send them.
Crazy,
and that doesn't sit right with me.
No, absolutely. And it's, I guess with all things, what we're talking about with agriculture, land use, the types of products that are being produced, the type of slaughterhouse, it's diversity. It's trying to make sure that there is something that serves all different stages, different scales of production, and that's available to people when they need it. You've got 11 hectares of vegetables, and I just wonder about your growing season, what you actually produce, how that works.
Well, like Robert, we've come to know what we can grow on our farm. So we've tried pretty much every vegetable going in the past, and you just learn what grows well and what doesn't. So things like carrots don't tend to do as well because our soil can get quite heavy, and if it's a little bit wet, then you end up with some really muddy carrots, and nobody loves muddy carrots. So we've settled on salad crops. So lettuce is probably our biggest, and brassicas, it's about 50-50. So kale, cabbage, cauliflower. We seem to grow those incredibly well. And I've got a friend who is a brassica agronomist down in Cornwall, and he came up and visited about a year ago now and looked around the farm, and he said, to be fair, these are growing as well as most of the conventional crops I see.
There's a lot of talk, isn't there, about growing lettuce and things like that in big stacked systems in old industrial sites or down on the London Underground. Have you got subways tunnelled out on your farm, or is it outside?
Well, I think the infrastructure costs of building that would take some paying back when we've got such fantastic, rich, fertile soil that we can just grow it in so effortlessly. In the city centres, then I think these could maybe be answers to food shortages, but I'm not that keen on growing all our food in sanitized boxes. I quite like the idea of getting a little bit of dirt on my cabbage and eating that.
Absolutely. So, Robert, over the last 20 years or so, you talked about the fact that you've made lots of ecological changes, ecological improvements. And I wonder, when we've talked in the past, you said that, there's a price tag attached to these things. So I wonder what sort of things you've done and where you managed to find the funding to do what you've done.
Well, we started about 20 years ago trying to improve the biodiversity in the farm, taking these unproductive areas of land out of mainly cereal production. So at that time there was funding available and quite a lot of funding. So there were capital payments that we could fence off these areas. We could put new hedges in. Then in these areas we planted a mixture of crops. So if you imagine a bowl of muesli and just putting that in the ground, and you've got oats and barley and maybe not cranberries, but you had fodder radish and sunflowers and a really purple crop called phacelia. Now, phacelia is really good because it's great for bees and it's great for birds as well. So we put these in and we were paid for doing so, and that provided a great boost for nature on what had been a farm that, as Ben mentioned, you tried to work hard to make a return from every acre. So it wasn't crop or it wasn't grass. So the funding was there to do that, and it has been there to do that over the last 20 years, but on a diminishing amount. I guess I've got slight concern at the moment that these funds there might be a bit of a gap for 2 or 3 years until our new agricultural system in Scotland is worked out as to what's happening in 2024. My concern on the agroecology point of view is whether there will be consistent funding.
Do you feel that if the funding does reduce as a result of Brexit, that you'll be less able, because you're in this position as a tenant farmer of needing to make every acre count, as you both talked about? Do you feel that there is a danger that you won't be able to do as much in terms of the ecology on your farm, or do you think you're in a position now where you've been doing it for 20 years and you can kind of just get on with it, even if there is a dip?
Yeah, I think we will, and certainly the areas that are fenced off, there's absolutely no reason, because they were fenced off for a reason, and that was because they were unproductive. The only way I could see them coming out of the management options that we are using them for is if they were going back to grass, and I can't see us taking out a fence to put them back to grass for a short-term period. The fact they're fenced off means there would be the option to plant trees on them with a little bit more investment in fencing.
Ben, your main farm's down on the floodplain, and I think you were saying something like a third of it gets flooded for a couple of months, and even one year recently it was 6 months. That's pretty serious. That's a lot of your land that's out of production for a long time. How does it affect your management?
Well, one of the reasons that we have put it all to permanent pasture is in the past that we had tried growing things on there and we lost that game far too many times. So putting grass there is about the one of the best things you can do, because you've got permanent grass, deep roots. It helps with the infiltration, so it can hold a lot more water. If you're ploughing it, there are a lot of farms along the river, gets ploughed, and then heavy rainfall, you get a lot of topsoil runoff into the water, into the rivers, which is an absolute disaster for wildlife. So we've said some recovery from flooding. So 2019, from the 1st of October 2019 until sometime in March in 2020, our floodland was pretty much constantly underwater. We had 2 of the worst floods that we'd ever had. And so if you think, I think at parts it was about 5 foot underwater. So if you can imagine 5 foot of water for 6 months pressing down on grass, there's not going to be an awful lot alive in that soil by the end of it. So when it dried up, we go through it with a subsoiler, just help alleviate some compaction. And it's amazing how some of these old river meadows just recover. They just bounce back. We find we don't have to do a lot of reseeding or anything like that. There were patches where the extensive water had just completely ruined it, but you can throw a little bit of grass seed on top of it and it bounces back. But the good old grass species that are there, they've developed to be there because they can take a bit of a beating from some water.
Just again, because not everybody who's listening is a farmer. What does subsoiling mean?
So subsoiling basically alleviates compaction. So if you think in your garden, you might go with a fork, put your foot on the fork, put it in the ground, give it a bit of a wiggle, gets a bit of air into the ground, try and kickstart it back to life.
So it's the same kind of process, but with a tractor and a thing on the back.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder, because we talk about the soil carbon sponge and the amount of water that can be held, and the healthier the soil, the deeper the root systems, the more water can be held there. And because, you know, the way that you've been managing it, I wonder if, obviously it's easier if you're a bird and you can look down on these things, but whether you get a sense in the summertime, whether your land is in a better condition, you've got less bare ground in the sward than some of your neighbours that are managing in different ways.
Well, I actually bought a drone last year to do that very thing. The biggest problem with last year, like I was saying, massive floods, and then it stopped raining in March, and then it didn't start raining again, I think, until about June. So actually the subsoiling was one of the worst things we could have done, because it then just dried the ground out too much. One thing I'm doing is this year, my top of my priority list is better grazing management. So looking at rotational or mob grazing to more intensively graze areas for short times and then move them onto fresh patch to allow that grass then a good month to regrow, not only on the surface but also the roots as well. Up at the new farm, the field sizes haven't changed. I've got a map, I think, from 1885. The field sizes are all exactly the same. It's a fairly small, pretty square fields, and it just lends itself perfectly to that rotational grazing. Just looking at it slightly differently, one of the other issues from having mild, wet winters that we have is the pests that we have on the vegetables. So normally you need a good frost to kill off the aphids, the whiteflies that we have on the brassicas and the lettuce. So bringing more mild winters, as we've seen with the recent emergency authorization on the neonicotinoids on sugar beet, their argument was that not having decent frost to kill off the aphids, so we need to look at ways. We already do things to encourage beneficial insects on the farm, such as planting buckwheat, which attracts hoverflies and lacewings that feed on aphids. So we need to do more things to encourage those beneficial insects to keep on top of those pests, because otherwise we will have more and more cases of pests and diseases that are usually killed off by the cold snap that we tend to have in the winter.
So it's about managing nature better, allowing nature to manage itself better, having, again, more diversity within the insect life and the bird life that exists, restoring that natural balance, I suppose, that we've been so good at kind of eliminating over the course of the last 70 years. In one way or another. Robert, just, clearly Scotland gets a bit of rain as well. Are you thinking of looking at mob grazing and that sort of thing on your farm?
Yes, we are. We tend to do it, but not very scientifically, I would suggest. We have big enough herds or big enough mobs that we move around, but there's not the planning to it, and we don't maybe take into account residuals enough moving the stock on. So I think it is something we need to look at.
You've both talked about wildlife quite a lot. You're clearly both very proud of the wildlife that you have on your farm, particularly the bird life. And Robert, during the COVID lockdowns, you were telling me that you've taken time to sit down and actually count the birds that you've got at Cowbog. What did you find?
Well, like you say, I sat down and I thought I'd seen quite a lot this year, and think possibly just being at home that little bit more, not attending agricultural shows for 2 or 3 weeks in the summer meant that you saw a full season. On our 2 farms at 420 acres, we found 85 species of bird on it, not including seagulls, because they confused me a little bit. I can pick 1 or 2 out, but not all of them. And it was reassuring that what we were doing was providing enough food sources and nesting sites for both ground nesting birds and hedge nesting and tree nesting birds.
85 species is a really good healthy number. And for those, were you tending to just see sort of 1s and 2s, or were you seeing sort of decent sized flocks?
Well, I guess the likes of our barn owls that need a bit more of a territory, we weren't seeing those so much. And certainly last year, whether it was with the dry weather, they didn't have fantastic broods last year, because somebody comes in to ring bring them on their legs to take account. But our partridge that we've seen last year did surprisingly well, probably the best grey partridge broods we've seen. Over winter, whether it's because it's a little bit harder, we've seen tremendous flocks of linnets and redwings and bramblings. And just a couple of mornings ago, saw about 150 skylarks when I was out moving a fence for some cows in the field. So I think there are enough numbers of priority species.
Excellent. I think you might have Ben coming for a visit, because Ben, you told me that you've become something of a twitcher recently, and that this is a newfound passion for you. Do you think there've always been loads of birds on your farm and you've just been unaware, or is it that has there been an increase recently?
I definitely think there's been an increase. Like you said, it's a relatively recent interest in that I'll be out picking vegetables all day and you'll just hear some bird like just twittering away, and then you'll get your phone out and then you'll start sort of going through the RSPB website, just looking at, trying to listen to various calls to try and figure out what it is. We have got a fantastic range of birds, and the wild bird mix that we have as part of the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, where we've got sunflowers, millet, quinoa, things like that, all these seeds. We've got charms of finches, absolutely insane amounts. It's murmurations that I've never seen. I've always ever seen a couple on a hedge or something, but to see them in these numbers is absolutely mind-boggling. So that's when you start thinking, oh, so what's that? And then a couple of different types of bird, stone chats and reed buntings, which I'd never heard of before. And they might have been there, but maybe just that I wasn't looking for them. So again, skylarks, wagtails, yellow and grey wagtails, which are, a lot of these birds, like the skylarks, the wagtails, meadow pipits, they feed on invertebrates, so they're also helping us with our pest problems. They'll be taking slugs, there'll be any little bugs, flea beetle, they'll be pecking away trying to get hold of those. So it's fantastic to see them, and that if you've got healthy bird populations, then they're only there because they've got the feed source there for them. If you've just got farms without any space for nature, then you can't expect them to thrive.
There are fantastic things that birds can do for you, aren't there? So just in terms of dealing with face flies, for example, if you've got a deep enough sward, then you attract the birds that then come in and eat the larvae, so that you don't get so many of the face flies. And you talked about things that you've done on your farm specifically to help different species.
So we've got plots for ground nesting birds, so it's a hectare of just bare earth, which is to encourage lapwings. And lapwings are a bird that when I was growing up, we always used to go, my parents used to take me in the car and we used to go down, and they're fantastic birds, and they're cool, and they're sort of slightly curvy wing shape. And we had so many of them. And then I don't know why, but we just suddenly stopped seeing quite so many. We weren't really intensifying our farming practices. Quite the opposite. Like I said, 20 years ago, we went organic, but we have started to see them come back, and you'll get one come back and then it'll go away, and then you might get a couple. And now we're starting to see groups of them sort of colonizing this wild bird nesting area, and that's fantastic to see. And as again I said, the wild bird mix that we plant specifically for them. But in the veg crops, we do have a lot of fat hen, which is one of our biggest weeds we have on the farm. But the seeds from the fat hen, birds absolutely love it. So if there's space within the crop to encourage birds as well, rather than just having plots separately to encourage them, then I'm all for that.
It's interesting, isn't it? One of the things that I've heard about the decline in wildlife and bird life on farms is that it's partly just because machinery and farmers themselves are becoming more efficient, so there's less waste just lying around on the farm, less grain that gets spilled. And obviously, farmers don't want to spill grain unless they really need to. But what you're doing there is creating those habitats, it's creating the wildflowers. So that seed is having the chance to produce itself. And, it's really good to hear. Robert, we're nearing the end of the programme, and I just wanted to come back and touch on something else before we finish. And when we talked before the programme, you'd said that you wanted to develop your farm, bring the public onto the farm and make it a sort of distant cousin of River Cottage. What does that mean? What do you want to do?
We're really keen, I think, like a lot of farmers, and we're really keen on trying to help share our story and tell people or show people how their food is produced and try and dispel some of the myths. There's an awful lot of noise about at the moment from everywhere about you shouldn't eat this and you shouldn't eat that. But we'd rather take people around the farm on tours that we run and show them what we're doing from an agroecology point of view, but also say how it relates to their food.
And so you're actively bringing people there. You're inviting groups to come and have experience days and that sort of thing. What would an experience day entail? What would it feel like if I came to your farm with my family?
When people arrive, we obviously welcome them and we give people a little bit of the history of the farm and why we're here and how long we've been here and a little bit about the area, what we're doing on the farm in terms of the Hereford cattle and the malting barley production. Then we jump on tractors and trailers and we tour around and show people the crops, explain the difference between an oat crop and a barley crop and why we're growing it. And then onto our cattle, which are, they're very friendly cows, our cows, and they'll wander over to a trailer and they'll like a head scratch. So explaining to people how they're grazing the grass rather than having to rely on soya, which there's a lot of ruminants get blamed for soya production, and how it relates to a more sustainable product in the UK. And then once we've done that, we invite people back in for a meal of our products and neighbours' products. And as much as we can, we're doing that from an on-farm basis. So we're just about to put up a small polytunnel to, if we need chilies, we'd rather have them from our own farm than nipping off to the grocers and getting some from who knows where in the country.
Fantastic. And your wife is helping, I think, with the catering. And so you're doing catering on the farm as well. And that's becoming part of your business.
Oh, yeah. I'm absolutely atrocious in the kitchen. I'm much better on the farm. So Lucy, my wife, she more or less on the back of COVID and having to stop farm tours and guests, she's started her own catering company, and that ties into our tours, and she knows how to make best use of the seasonal products that we've got here.
Fantastic. That's been a really interesting sort of whistle-stop tour through mixed production, where we've been talking about cereals, vegetables and beef all mixed in there, as well as the issues around diversification. So bringing people onto the farm, having experience days, the joy for farmers of seeing the wildlife and the bird life doing their thing on the farm. So that's fantastic. That's all we got time for. I'd like to thank my guests, Ben Andrews from Broadward Hall in Herefordshire and Robert Wilson from Cowbog Farm in the Scottish Borders. Our Agroecological Beef podcast is already available, and there are more programmes in this series coming soon. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us and share our links. Farmgate is a partnership project for Farmwell and FAI Farms. We're funded by Sankalpa, and you can join the conversation on Twitter by searching for Farmgate Podcast. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.